Happy almost 4th of July. It's so great to see you all here this morning. You know, I was actually talking to some people over at New Life, and they're like, man, there was so many people that called out today, not because it's 4th of July weekend, but because it's hot. They called in hot. I didn't know that was a thing, but you guys all know that now for work on Monday or this week. You can just call in and say, I'm hot. I'm sorry. It's too hot. Well, it's great to see you all here today for 4th of July. All of a sudden, I realized that when I go home, I'm going to have to go watch the Will Smith Independence Day movie because it's not 4th of July without Independence Day, right? Yes, we're going to have to do that. I love the 4th of July. I love the 4th of July. The 4th of July is one of my favorites. It's a super fun thing. It's not just because I'm, a veteran and all that stuff. It's not just because of that. It's not just because all the fireworks, although the fireworks are really cool. In fact, a fun fact, I was actually just talking about that in the team meeting this morning. I was looking up some fun facts of Independence Day, and that song that most people always hear at the end of every fireworks show, right? It's called the Overture of 1812, and it's got a whole bunch of drums and cannons and all kinds of stuff that goes out. Turns out that song was written by a Russian composer to commemorate the end of the War of 1812 when they had dominance over the French. So it's literally about taking freedom away, but we celebrate it the other way. But it's fascinating, the facts you learn. I love the 4th of July, and it's not just because the fireworks. They're fun. They're really cool. I like to see things explode. In fact, for a few years, many years actually, I would run a fireworks stand for a church. And at this church, that was how we paid for kids camp. And the best year we ever had was 2020, right? With COVID going on, people really wanted to blow stuff up. The riots were happening in Seattle. We were like, you want to take a ferry ride over to Seattle? Come get your fireworks first. So many kids got to know Jesus that year because of that. It was great. But it's not, I don't love 4th of July because of the fireworks or because of apple pie or donuts or anything like that. I love the 4th of July. I love the 4th of July because of what it represents. It's not just Independence Day, but it represents freedom. It represents freedom. That was the intent of the Declaration of Independence. That was the intent of it, was freedom. And this day commemorates freedom. It's a holiday literally all about freedom. And what freedom is, should be, and could be. It's all about freedom. But freedom is a little bit different for everybody, isn't it? People have a lot of different versions of freedom. People have a lot of different ideas of what that word means. In fact, that word is pretty elusive. It has a lot of different definitions. I looked up a lot of different definitions, and I was surprised how many definitions that people have of freedom. And if I were to ask each and every one of you what your definition of freedom is, you would probably all give me somewhat of a different definition. You'd probably have little differences about what freedom means to you. It's a little bit of an elusive word. Like for some of you, all of a sudden, if I were to say, okay, what does freedom mean to you? Some of you guys might say America, right? America, absolutely. Okay, what does that mean though? What does that mean to you? And it gets a little more tricky to define. How about this? A lot of people might say, well, freedom means the American dream. Well, what is the American dream for you? Because to some people, the American dream is to have 2 houses, 2 cars, a boat. For some people, it's to have a TV in every single room, including the bathroom. And for some people, the American dream is just to have indoor plumbing. The American dream is different for everyone. So is that what freedom is and what we base freedom on? Now, if I were to ask other people, okay, what does freedom actually mean to you? If I ask my teenagers this, my son, he's the greatest example of that. My son, he's 16 years old. He has a car. He's got the keys. And he was like, yes, I got my license. I am free. I have freedom. This is amazing. And he was out of the house. He was like, see you later, posers. I'm out. I'm going to be free. And then he went to the gas pump. And it was like, oh, freedom costs money. And then he came back 5 minutes later. I'm going to my room. Yeah, freedom is different for everyone. Some people might actually say, okay, well, freedom means that here in this country we can say what we want, we can do what we want, we can be what we want. Is that what we're experiencing now in our culture, though? Not necessarily, right? Try to say what you want or only anything that you want on Facebook or online. See if it gets taken down, right? You could say stuff, but you can also get in trouble for saying stuff and doing stuff. And can you do anything that you want to do? Can you go rob a bank? Well, technically you can, but your freedom's going to get hijacked pretty quick, right? We don't necessarily have freedom. So what does freedom actually mean to all of us? You know, I looked it up inside of a definition. I looked it up inside of the Webster's Dictionary, and it had some surprising definitions, okay? First off, I'm using an old Webster's Dictionary. It's the book form, okay? You know it's old when I have a book, right? So now I'm using that old one, and it actually told me the very first definition that comes up is freedom is the absence of not being free. It's like, well, that's dumb. Like, being poor is the absence of not being poor. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But the second definition that came up was actually really telling, and it says this: freedom is to be bound to nothing. Well, is that really what freedom is, to be bound to nothing? I have a friend of mine, and he says that he is truly free because he is bound to nothing. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have kids. He said, I do not want a wife. I do not want kids. I do not want responsibilities because I am truly free. I believe in the American dream, and the American dream is to be free of everything. He is the most miserable 45-year-old I have ever met in my life. Freedom, his definition of freedom, is to be bound by nothing. Yet it makes him miserable. So is that the right definition? Another friend of mine was telling me about freedom and his definition of freedom. And he says this. He says, in America, we cannot actually understand what freedom is because we were born with it. Because we were born with it and we take it for granted. And therefore, we can't come up with a definition of freedom because we don't know exactly what it is that we're trying to define because we've never been without it. He's a missionary in Russia, a place where they don't have very much freedom. And I could tell you, he knows what freedom is. He knows exactly what freedom is. But we take it for granted in this country. And I think we take it for granted is because we don't necessarily have a one definition. We don't have a good definition of what freedom is because freedom actually means something different to us in different stages of our lives. And it means something different in our own culture, and it means something different throughout time. In fact, every time frame in America and every time frame in the world, people have sought freedom, but they've sought it different because the culture has always shifted. The culture has shifted, and as the culture shifts, the definition and ideas of what makes you free and what freedom looks like to you becomes a little bit different. Becomes different. But here in America, we get to celebrate. We get to celebrate freedom. Now, somebody else was actually saying this. He was saying that, hey, you know what? Well, we are free in this country, and we know we're free in this country because the Constitution guarantees that we are free in this country, because it is the Constitution that makes us free. There was somebody who actually had quoted this to one of our Supreme Court justices, an old justice, Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was actually the first African-American Supreme Court justice, and he served and brilliantly and did a whole bunch of stuff, but somebody had actually come up to him and said, look, it is by the Constitution that we are free. He says this: it is because of the founders we have freedom, and our Constitution that makes us all free no matter what. And he had this great response because he responded and he said this: the Constitution is a means, it is not an end. And it was not what the framers had intended, it is what the framers were granted, what they were allowed at the time. What they were allowed at the time. And the reason why they allowed at the time was because the cultural differences. The culture at that time, it was very different. They wanted to make something different, but they also were in the culture, and the culture definition of freedom was different. Thurgood Marshall would actually also quote and would go on to say, he says, I wish that the framers had actually dealt with slavery back then. I wish they had actually dealt with women's rights back then. I wish that they had dealt with a lot of different things that they could have, but they couldn't because it wasn't in the culture, and they didn't. And he continues on the quote. He says this: the government the founders devised was defective from the start. It required several amendments, a civil war, a major social transformation to attain the system we hold fundamental today. What they provided, though, was the spark of freedom, but true freedom would become an evolving choice. So is that what freedom is? It's an evolving choice. It's a choice that we continue on. That we continue on to remake and to define, to not necessarily have a total definition, but instead to continue to progress in our freedoms today? Well, a lot of people would actually argue with that and would agree with that. And they would say that the founders had actually agreed with that they knew it was a choice and that it would evolve. And that's why they built things into the Constitution to allow it to evolve. Now, a lot of people would also have fault with that, and people would also say that, wait, the founders, they were wrong because they didn't put this in, this, and this in. I actually was looking up some other quotes from another guy that I really love. His name is Peter Gomez. Peter Gomez is actually a preacher. He was a reverend for all the elite in Washington, D.C. He was known because he was actually this preacher, this reverend, who could bridge the gap between all the different parties, and he would speak to everyone. And he would be speaking to senators and to congressmen and to presidents. And he was such a great preacher to be able to bridge that gap. And he said this, 200 years later, after the Constitution, we cannot criticize the founders for not living in the enlightened 20th century, as some people do today, but rather acknowledge that freedom is a slowly evolving process, not always discernible and not always achievable for all, but always to be pursued, cherished, and celebrated when found, and always to be used for its ultimate purpose and its ultimate ends. What is its ultimate ends then? Peter Gomez would actually go on later on to say exactly what freedom was. He would say that even though not everybody can recognize it, because we have a secular definition of freedom and a secular idea of freedom, it is actually Jesus that makes us free. It is actually God that makes us free. And so therefore, what is the ultimate ends of freedom? The ultimate end of freedom is building the kingdom. The ultimate end of freedom is being with God. The ultimate freedom is actually knowing who God is. And any definition of freedom without God is not a definition that is worth very much, because it is just made by human ideas. And human ideas will fail. Therefore, the definition must be the inclusion of God. And we see that throughout the Bible. We see that throughout the Bible as freedom is discussed and freedom is challenged and freedom is talked about. We see that in Paul in Galatians 5:1. In Galatians 5:1, Paul says this, "It is freedom that Christ has set us free." It's in freedom that Christ has set us free. "Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery." So what is the yoke of slavery in this? I would say today a lot of people are like, well, great, we don't have slavery in this country. We're good now. We're all free. But is that what he's actually talking about? No. No, we're actually slaves to almost anything that enslaves us. We are slaves to our society. We're slaves to government. We're slaves to different thought. We are slaves to different things that would impel us. We're slaves to, some people would say they're slaves to drinking. They're slaves to pornography. They're slaves to a lot of different things that are in our lives and in our culture. We can be slaves to almost anything, but it is God that frees us from all of that. In this context, Paul was actually also talking about the law. He's talking about not just the culture, and at this time they were underneath Roman rule, and so he's not only talking about the culture, but he's also talking about the law that they had also had, that the Jews were following. He's saying, look, all of that stuff was meant to entrap you. All of that stuff actually kept us narrowed, but you are no longer narrowed. You are free. You are free in Jesus. You are free in Christ. And with that freedom, though, comes responsibility. When we are free in Jesus and we know true freedom, and I would tell you this, true freedom is knowing Jesus, is following Jesus, and is being with Jesus. But I would tell you this, if you are in true freedom and you know who Jesus is and you follow Jesus, that comes with responsibility. Because freedom is always tasked with responsibility. And Paul tells us that. He tells us that in Galatians 5:13, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh, but instead rather serve one another humbly." It means if you are free and you're free in Jesus, then what is the one task you need to do? Serve each other humbly. Love each other. Be free and show other people freedom through love and through being with them and guiding them and helping them in all things, but do not become a slave to flesh. A lot of times when we read that verse of do not become a slave to flesh, all of a sudden we think of all of our modern kind of concepts of what the flesh is, right? And we get an idea of, okay, I know what that means. But I love it because Paul actually defines it for us. He tells us exactly what being a slave to flesh is. He says that in Galatians 5:19 through 20. He says, "The acts of flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, pride, and the like." Basically, a lot of stuff we do in America. And we're free to do those things in America because we have freedom by law. We have freedom in the Constitution. We have freedom. We have some of those things are even protected underneath the Constitution. But do those things actually give you freedom? No, they enslave you. They entrap you. They make it so that way you cannot move. They do not actually help. They do not set you free. Those things entrap you more. They make you a slave to them. But Paul is telling us what does make us free. He makes us free in Jesus. Jesus gives us freedom. And when we have that freedom, we can also exhibit and know what that freedom looks like. Because that freedom, we will see when somebody is truly free in Jesus, then they start to show that fruit of the Spirit. And we see that in Galatians 5:22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And against such things there is no law. All of those things are what we gain in freedom. What we have in freedom with Jesus. All of those things. We stay away from the flesh. But I would tell you this, that any freedom that we have, any freedom definition we have, needs to first off start off with God. It needs to recognize who God is and God in that it is with God, that it is with Jesus that makes us free. And then it also has to recognize that it is the things of this world that seek to enslave us. So to challenge those things in the world, we need to show those fruits of the Spirit. And those fruits of the Spirit, when we exhibit those, that is what sets other people around us free as well. Free indeed. I love that song. Jesus makes us free. Free indeed. It's an amazing song, and it is so true. Because it is Jesus, only with Jesus, that we can know true freedom. I would tell you this. There's actually a pretty good record of our founders knowing this very same concept. In fact, the founders of our country, they knew this exact same concept, and they exhibited it all the time. In fact, some of our founders were actually quoted as saying this. Benjamin Franklin was quoted as saying, "It is with God that true freedom is found, not government." Thomas Jefferson said, "Freedom and liberty are only granted by God, not by people." They knew, the founders knew, what gave us freedom and what that definition of freedom really was, that the definition of freedom should always include God within it, that government was limited, that the people were limited, but God was unlimited, and through God, that was where we would find true freedom and true change and true culture and true everything was always through God. Somebody actually was coming up to me and arguing with me at one point, and they were saying, well, look, most of the founders were actually atheists. That apparently is the line that is today, that most of the founders must have been atheists. Well, actually, if you were to look at the Declaration of Independence, over 50% of the people that signed the Declaration of Independence had seminary degrees in Bible schooling. Over 50%. The rest of them were deacons in churches and elders and all over. There was a couple of them that were atheists or that had more atheistic ideas or different ideas. But I would tell you, we can go back and forth on this and show, but there's a huge record of they also celebrated God. There's a huge record to that. There was also a huge record of showing the prayer meetings and Bible readings before they signed the Declaration of Independence, before they went into the constitutional mindset and the recognition of what God was doing in their lives. In fact, before the Declaration of Independence was signed, one of the verses that they read was that in Galatians 5:1, that it is freedom found in Christ. They read that before they signed their names on that document. How cool is that? When you think of that we can be connected to them today, even through that. And in fact, we see that throughout history. We see that their influence and how everything was set up, their influence is actually imprinted. It's why the very First Amendment was actually a First Amendment of freedom of religion. It was freedom of religion because it was a recognition that government should actually remain small because government was going to be limited. It wasn't going to provide God and with Jesus. And it's even recognized on our dollar bills. If you were to look at a dollar bill, and I have a picture up here for you guys. If you were to look at a dollar bill, and you were to look on the back of what that dollar bill says, and exactly what it is, it's very, very telling. Because you have, first off, the first president of the United States, George Washington, and above him, on the other side, you also see, "In God we trust." And God we trust is still on the back of our dollar bills. And God we trust. And then you have the pyramid with the eye and all of that stuff. Now, if you've looked at National Treasure and you've seen all the conspiracy movies and you've read Dan Brown books, then you guys would probably be like, oh, it was done by the Illuminati or it was done by the Masons or all this stuff. That's not true. What all this was actually meant from the writers of this, from the actual writers and the actual creators of this, what it was meant to symbolize was this, was that we were building a new society, just like Egypt was building a new society in this pyramid. We were building a new society, and there's a building that is continually always going, but the top of the pyramid is always the watchful eye of God. That is always the providence of God. And it's the watchful eye of God that is overlooking all of it. And above it, you will see there's some phrases in Latin. The first one is annuit coeptus, which means he approves, meaning God approves of our undertakings. That first one, he approves of our undertakings. Below it says novus ordo secularum, which is the new order of ages. Meaning that he approves, that it is God approves of our undertakings of freedom and building of this nation under God's direction and watchful eye. The dollar agrees. It was underneath God that we would develop freedom and know what freedom is. But we've lost that idea. We continue to lose that idea here in this country sometimes, don't we? Even in our families and around all of us. We lose that idea, and I know where we lose that idea from. We lose that idea because we get confused on the definition of what freedom is. And instead of it becoming freedom for all in Jesus or freedom for all in God, we make it freedom for me or freedom for you and freedom just for the individuals and not about us as a society. And what does freedom mean for each of us as individuals, and how do we seek out that freedom made by people, not by God? Today, we also lose some of that freedom, and that we always continue to trust. A lot of places trust in the government. They say, well, we are more free by government, by laws, by lawsuits, by all of those things. That's what gives us freedom. We get freedom from all of the governmental things, or we get freedom by the things that we're allowed to do or the things we're not allowed to do. We get freedom through that. I would tell you that that's not ever what the definition of freedom was for the founders of the country. The freedom was not always about what we were allowed to do and not to do. It was always a recognition that people are flawed, that people will always be flawed, and therefore our definition of freedom will always be flawed. But the perfect definition of freedom is in Jesus. It's in knowing Jesus and following Jesus and building Jesus. And if you really want to know what freedom is, and you want to celebrate freedom, and you want to pursue freedom, and you want to show you want to show people around you what true freedom is, then share Jesus. Share Jesus with them. Show them who Jesus is. Show them who Jesus is through the fruit of the Spirit. Show them who Jesus is in your lives and could be in their lives, because that is where true freedom and happiness and joy comes from. It's in Jesus. Our Constitution doesn't give us perfect freedom. Our government doesn't give us perfect freedom. Our work, our desires, our ideas do not give us perfect freedom, but Jesus does. Jesus does, and he died for you to give that to you. In Galatians 5:1, it is freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened by the yoke of slavery. It is Jesus, and in Jesus we find freedom. As the band comes up, we start to conclude, and communion gets passed out. I will tell you this. A friend of mine in Russia, he comes to me at one time, and he came and he visited. And he was telling me all about looking around, and he's looking around at all these different places. We were in a conference with him and somebody who was another friend of mine who's over in Uganda. And they're looking around and they're going, my goodness, you guys are so much slaves. I said, what do you mean we're so slaves? He says, you're slaves to everything around you. You're slaves to Netflix. You're slaves to your house payment, to your car payment. You're slaves to all of those things. He says, we don't have to deal with any of those things in Russia. It's like, yeah, but death and hiding, that's kind of a thing you have to deal with. We take our whole freedom, though, for granted, don't we? We take it for granted where we just wake up and we realize that we're free, and we're free to go out and to be with Jesus. We're free to actually celebrate Jesus and get to know Jesus and have that freedom. My friend in Russia, he's telling me all about the history of some of the Russian missionaries. You know, in the 1970s, it was actually a big deal. In Russia, you could not be a Christian. And if you were a Christian, especially if you were military or anything like that, if you were a Christian and you were found out, they would torture you and put you through a re-education camp. They would tell you that you're only allowed to trust in the government, you're only allowed to trust in people, but God is not real, Jesus is not real. Why? Because they know that Jesus would have given them hope and would have given them true freedom. So let's take that away. He would tell me stories of all the people that had gone through those re-education camps, where they would take them out and they'd put them in underwear and then make them walk out in the cold and stay there all night until they would either freeze to death or recant knowing Jesus. And if that didn't work, they would torture them, they would poke and prod them until they would die. In the 80s, it got a little bit better, and in the 90s, there were some laws that got passed that made it so that way they could no longer do that to Christians. But in 2016, Vladimir Putin actually put in new laws that understanding who Jesus is and not being a slave to sin and not being a slave to anything. Jesus didn't just die so that way you would have salvation. Jesus died so that you would have a life with Him, a life of freedom with Him right now, not later. But right now, together with Him and building up the kingdom with Him. And I think here we have forgotten that. We've often forgotten in our society that that's what freedom is supposed to be and what we're supposed to build, the kingdom of God together. I would tell you this, Jesus, when He died on the cross, He spilt His blood so that you would know Him. He broke His body. He broke His body so that way you would be able to experience and know what freedom is. And He died upon the cross so that you would truly be free, free not just of sin, but free to know Him, free to follow Him, free to be with Him, free to build the kingdom with Him. He gave you freedom, but do we take it for granted? I think oftentimes we do. Today as we take communion, I want you to take just a moment. I want you just to take a moment before you take communion. We'll have just a moment here, but I want you guys to look at that communion and I want you to think about this. I want you to think about what is your definition of freedom? What is your definition of freedom? Does it include God? And if it doesn't include God, make it include God. Make it include God. Ask God, how can I be free in you? And then before you take communion and take it on your own time as we sing this last worship song, as we think about Jesus, I want you guys to do me a favor. And I want you to think about that communion, what Jesus sacrificed, and that His sacrifice wasn't just to save you, but it was so that you would know Him and be a partner in freedom with Him.